Well, welcome back. My last guest is Rich Gallagher. He is one of the nation's leading experts on communication skills. His 8 nationally published books include What to Say to a Porcupine, and national #1 customer service bestseller and finalist for Business Book of the Year, as well as his latest book, How to Tell Anyone Anything, Breakthrough Techniques for Handling Difficult Conversations at Work. A former customer service executive, trained therapist, as well as a popular public speaker, Rich focused on the mechanics of what to say in difficult situations. Rich, welcome to the show.
Hi, Barry. Great to be with you.
Well, I won't even ask you this question. I've been asking everyone, why should you read this book this summer? Because every business owner, every day when they walk in, they've got difficult situations, right?
Well, that's absolutely correct. And this book talks about a simple, research-based approach for handling difficult situations at work, like toxic bosses, backstabbers, poor performers, even people who need to shower more often.
Oh, no, we have none of those kind of people at work. So what is really the key to handling the most difficult situations with customers and employees?
Well, what's interesting about this, many years ago I was one of Cornell University's first dual majors in engineering and psychology. People joked that I would grow up to build bridges that talk people out of jumping off of them. But later I went on to manage call centers, and as you mentioned, I'm trained as a psychotherapist. And what this book does is it uses an approach based on techniques that people like hostage negotiators, crisis counselors, and psychotherapists use in their most difficult situations. It's based on an approach that's known as strength-based psychology that's been in sweeping fields like athletic coaching and therapy, and it's starting to make its way into the business world as well. And the reason that people aren't doing it already is because every step of it goes against your human nature. This is actually a view of the world that you and I share in common. I mean, in your book, BAM, for example, your myth number 5 is the false belief that customer service is just common sense. Right. And when you're in a difficult situation, your human nature fails you as well. And so I lay out a 6-step process that if you learn it and if you follow it, will turn these into painless discussions that give you a much better chance of getting you what you want.
So let's talk about some of those 6 steps.
I break it down into an acronym that's known as CANDID. It's a 6-step process, and since we have about 8 minutes, I'm going to talk really fast. The first step is to compartmentalize your message into the safe and unsafe parts and always start in a safe place. So let's say you've got a backstabber who's gossiping about you, and the reason that she's doing that is just because you're a better employee than she is. An unsafe place to start would be to go to her and say, stop stabbing me in the back. You're probably not going to get a good outcome from that. At best, you're going to just drive things underground. But if instead you talk about the safe parts of why she's doing this by asking questions like, do you feel you're getting enough recognition of your work? Then guess what? You're suddenly in dialogue and on topic, which is where you want to be. And then the next step of the process is asking good questions. Because when you give a safe opening, people usually respond with their side of the story or their view of the world. And that leads you to what I call the oh my God moment, where you're thinking, what can I say now? And you really should be thinking about what you can ask.
Right.
So let's say you've got an employee whose head really isn't in the game. Instead of telling them that they need to turn their performance around, I'd be asking things like, what do you like about this job? Mm-hmm. What do you hate about this job? Where do you see yourself in the long term? What would you like to be doing? That both gives you information and also sends a very powerful signal to the other person that you're hearing and processing how they see the world, which leads me to the next step, which feels like sucking on a lemon for most people, which is to normalize the situation, to acknowledge and validate everything that the other person that says, listen carefully, every time they open their mouth. So let's say they have a toxic boss who's complaining about how everybody's slacking off. I realize you're going to bite your lip till it bleeds, but I want you to say things like, nobody wants to see people not doing enough work. So when I teach live training courses on this, and also in the book, I talk about what I call 3 octane levels of acknowledgement, where you observe, validate, or identify with what they're saying, and just plug the right words in, turn the crank, and away you go. Now, doesn't this feel like completely kissing up to the other person? It does. Mm-hmm. And the reason it's important is because when you do a good job of starting in a safe place, asking good questions, and normalizing the other person, the only reason that people ever argue with you is because they're trying to get you to see their view of the world. And when you make it clear that you do see their view of the world, they have nothing to fight with you about. Mm-hmm. And you can then be extraordinarily frank about what you want in the situation, as long as you discuss it factually. And that's the next step, is to discuss the facts of the situation. I'll use a sports analogy for this. I mean, if you were a Celtics fan last night, you were probably saying things like, they stunk, they choked, they couldn't close a deal. Now, words like that are not just scary, they're also useless because there's no such thing as an anti-stink drill or a non-choking procedure.
Right.
Let's say that somebody at work really stinks. You know, they need to shower more often. The kind of facts I'd be using is think about what's a legitimate reason why people do smell. I mean, you go to karate practice, for example. Right. And so I'd be saying things like, I notice that people get active and sweaty, and I tend to be more sensitive to that than other people. Where can we go from here? Right. If somebody's acting angry and you say, hey, you're angry all the time, the first thing they're going to say is, I'm not angry. But instead, if you boil it down into facts and say things like, when you say X, here's how I react to that, and where can we go with that, suddenly you're in a painless and productive dialogue that's exactly the kind of dialogue that people like Phil Jackson in basketball or Joe Torre in baseball have with their superstar players.
Right, exactly. I agree with you. Then you also say you can never, ever criticize anyone for anything. I know that's going to be a big disappointment to a lot of people out there. We're a nation of complainers, and we love to criticize.
Of course, and I guess the point I want to make is, you know, I love the dedication to your book. Your kids live in fear of what you're going to say at a restaurant, for example.
Exactly.
You know, and of course, if you're in a service situation, I respect asking for what it is that you want. But when you're dealing with people you're going to work with tomorrow and the day after that, the best you're going to get by complaining to them is sullen compliance, sabotage, all sorts of things that you really don't want out of this situation.
Now, you also talk about how you can take control of the conversation, Rich, and really make someone feel great in the process. But some people might say, well, by doing all this, what they may be kissing up, that you're not really taking control of the conversation, but you really are.
Very much so. In fact, when somebody is talking too much, I teach a technique called the acknowledging close. It works almost 100% of the time, where when you enthusiastically acknowledge the last thing they said and then start asking binary questions, you take control of the conversation and they feel good, because you're lavishing attention on them.
Absolutely. I want to switch gears. I want to talk a little bit about what to say to a porcupine, 20 humorous tales that get to the heart of great customer service, what I really loved. What was really the motivation behind writing this book?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, Barry, because I'm a huge fan of business fables like Fish and Who Moved My Cheese. I get a lot out of reading lessons like that. And so I started writing some humorous fables to use in my training courses that were based in the format of Aesop's fables that were written 2,500 years ago to teach life lessons to people who wouldn't have gotten the lesson otherwise. And it was really my wife who talked me into writing this book after me trying to convince her for a year that there was no market for humor. And as you know, it went on to become a #1 business humor bestseller and customer service bestseller.
And so talk about, is there one story in the book for those people that haven't read it that really stand out for you that you love to retell?
Well, a couple of them that really jump out for me is first the title story, What to Say to a Porcupine, because it uses a humorous story to go through all the things we're talking about in this interview today about acknowledging, validating, speaking to the person's interest, and still getting what you want out of a situation. One of my other favorites is a story called The Night Shift, which talks about how Sir Gawain and King Arthur put down a mob of peasants by listening to them and speaking to their interests and doing things to make them feel like they were part of the community as well.
You know, that it's really interesting because, you know, of course, you and I both deal in customer service, and what I always counsel people is mostly people who are calling in or dissatisfied, they know you probably can't satisfy their need exactly the way they want, but most people just really want to be listened to, right?
Totally, and if people understood that, that would be the golden secret of customer service, that it's not just what you can or can't do for them, which is important, by the way, but the kind of words that you use. And do an experiment, all of you who are listening to this show. Go out to the store and see how often people paraphrase or acknowledge what the other person's saying. It almost never happens.
Almost never.
Most people talk past each other. When you do that, you jump to the head of the line with everybody.
No, I absolutely agree. So where can people get the books and learn more about the wonderful work you're doing, Rich?
It's available in bookstores everywhere. You can order it on Amazon. My website is pointofcontactgroup.com for my live training, and the book itself has websites at howtotellanyoneanything.com and whattosaytoaporcupine.com.
Rich, thanks for being on the show, and have a good weekend.
Thank you, Barry. Take care.
You can find Barry on the web at www.barrymoltz.com. You've been listening to Business Insanity Talk Radio.